Joining us now, someone who knows an awful lot about this subject, an awful lot about world issues, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. She is also the author of Fascism, a Warning. Madam Secretary, thank you so much for being with us. I want to get your big picture take, since you have such insight into the world. Just big picture, what's the impact of the last few days, from the president's appearance in Helsinki side by side with Vladimir Putin to these 2 days of conflicting explanations about what went on?
Well, the impact internationally is that everybody wonders what is going on in the United States. He has managed to confuse everybody, but I think the thing that worries me most is that he's confused about what he's confused about, because there's absolutely no logic to what he's been saying. And I was in Europe a couple of weeks ago, and already then there were a lot of questions. And where was the United States? What was going to happen at NATO? How did he feel about Europe? And I think the issue really is we do not have any idea. And I think what is most dangerous at the moment is the fact that nobody on our side was in the meetings that he had with President Putin. And President Putin and his people are already putting out that they are going to be implementing something, and we don't know what it is. President Putin, if you notice, in the pictures had a pad and something to write with. I don't think that we have no way of knowing whether President Trump took any notes. And I can bet you that the Russians had some way of listening to knowing that everything that went on, and I don't think our people have a clue of what was decided.
In fact, the Washington Post reports this morning that senior military officials have been scrambling the last few days to try to understand what was agreed to in that room, and they can't come up with any answers. Is that unusual? You've been there. Is that unusual for senior officials in the U.S. government not to know what was agreed to in a meeting between world leaders?
Unusual would be a stunning way of saying this, because I've never heard of anything like this. And the whole point of our government, and I teach about decision making, and I was a part of it at a certain stage. We are an old country. We know how to make decisions. There is a system, but it requires some kind of contact and truthfulness between the person who has the conversation and those who are supposed to carry it out. And now that we know that the president doesn't know the difference between a negative and an affirmative and double negatives, it's very serious, because we have no idea what he said. And so, am I worried? I am definitely worried. I used to say I'm an optimist who worries a lot. I am worrying more.
You say that this administration is the gift that keeps on giving to Vladimir Putin. What do you mean?
Well, I think a perfect example, actually, and I was listening earlier on Montenegro. Part of the issue there is this is a country that wanted to be a part of NATO. There was a coup there because the Russians did not want them to have that role. And now what has happened is the gift is that the Russians are playing games in the Balkans and trying to get them to be much more part of the former Russian group of people that were supportive of them. And this is a gift to Putin, that all of a sudden Montenegro, who have provided troops to help in Afghanistan, are now being questioned about whether we would defend them, which we're supposed to do under Article 5 of NATO. That is a gift to Putin.
President Trump ran on this agenda of America first. He went over to Europe talking about projecting American strength. Do you think the net result of his appearance and his meeting with Vladimir Putin, and again, the resulting explanations that have come from it, do you believe it projects strength to the world?
I really am sorry to have to say this, because it doesn't. It projects complete confusion. And America's power, which I believe in, has really reflected our views about what we see as our role in the world. How do we operate with our allies? How are decisions made? What is the rationale behind the things that our president says? And none of that is evident. And he takes credit for things that all of a sudden NATO is more powerful than it was, and at the same time undermines the whole concept with his comments about Montenegro, because I think that, and I'm beginning to think that he simply does not understand the connection of one thing to another.
Well, I don't know whether he understands the connection or not, because I have not heard over the course of the campaign and his presidency a solid commitment. He's paid lip service to it in NATO last year and again this year to the idea of mutual defense, but it's not something he certainly dwells on. So it's not clear to me that it is something he firmly, solidly believes in, especially given what he just said about Montenegro.
Well, I think that's true, and I think that he takes, quote, pride in the fact that he has now bullied people into saying that they're going to pay more, when that also just shows a lack of understanding about how NATO works and why NATO is a creation that the United States thought up and believes in, because it adds to our strength, and in terms of developing what has to happen in the world, generally in terms of the international system and protecting those that are on our side.
But you do think it is a good thing for the nations who were part of NATO to start spending more in their own defense. That was agreed to back in Wales, that by 2024 they'd be spending 2% of their GDP on their own defense. That is something you support?
Absolutely, no question about it. And when I was in office, I used to say that NATO is not a philanthropic organization. You have to participate. You have to be ready to participate. It's just the language that goes with things, and kind of the taking credit and bullying and really confusing people. I think that's the only word I can use about what's going on. I think I've used every adjective I can think of to describe what's going on, and it is indescribable.
I want to ask you about Mike McFaul in something that happened yesterday. Sarah Sanders, the White House press secretary, acknowledged that President Trump, behind closed doors with Vladimir Putin, and again, we don't know for sure what was discussed, but Sarah Sanders told us that the President of the United States did discuss with Vladimir Putin the idea of perhaps making Mike McFaul or turning him over for questioning by Russian investigators. And Sarah Sanders said that when they have an announcement to make on this, they would let us know. Again, you were Secretary of State. You oversaw the State Department embassies all around the world. The idea of making a former U.S. ambassador available or turning him over for Russian questioning, your reaction?
Outrageous, because the ambassadors are there representing the United States. We have to be supportive of them. It is the whole process of diplomacy. And this not only undermines Mike McFaul, who is really an incredibly good and smart diplomat and somebody who understands Russia, but everybody, every diplomat now, because the jobs are very hard, and it is the job of the State Department and the Secretary of State and the President of the United States to stand behind our ambassadors and not just kind of put them out there for bait. I think it's outrageous.
You talk about the language, and that's something I want to delve into a little bit more here, because on this subject, for instance, Sarah Sanders says it's up for discussion. We'll let you know when we have more. And so often we've been told by people on Twitter and elsewhere, you know what, we shouldn't pay attention to things that the White House says the president is considering. We should only pay attention to the actions. Look at the actions. Again, you were a key player in the world of diplomacy. Do the words matter? Should we be ignoring the words in this case?
Well, you can't ignore the words. I think that everybody listens to what the United States says and kind of tries to parse the words, figure out what really has been meant. Obviously, the actions are the most important aspect of it, but before the actions, there's an awful lot of trying to analyze what really has been said. And all I can tell you is, not just from my own time in office, but just recently, I have one of the things that's hard is when you're in a foreign country and you're a former diplomat, not to be critical of your president. I mean, you have to be careful. But after a while, everybody's credibility is on the line if we can not explain what the president is saying. And it is very hard to figure it out. And so words do matter.
You just mentioned you've been talking to leaders all around the world here. I've heard you talk about the fact that you know Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is someone that you met with and work with right now. What does he make of this? Put yourself in his head right now. We just did get this statement. He'd been talking to his own ambassadors, talking about the fact that he thinks his meeting with the president's been undermined by Democrats and the media here. What does Vladimir Putin really think about this meeting?
Well, just look at his body language. I mean, first in the meeting where he was kind of sitting back and being bored, but during the press conference, you could just kind of see smirks that he was on his face. But I also do know the following thing. He is smart. He is a former KGB agent. When we were with him, he was the one, he didn't speak from notes, but he always took notes. He is tough and smart, and frankly, he has played a weak hand very well because he's got help from some people in the United States in terms of kind of, as I said, President Trump has been a gift in terms of following out what I think is Putin's plan, which is to separate us from our allies and make it more difficult for America to be the leader of the free world.
Do you think he has something on President Trump?
I have no idea, but I do think that he knows how to play him. And there is this kind of flattery business, or I find it so peculiar, having been in meetings with an American president, President Clinton, and how you can get along. He got along with Boris Yeltsin, but pretty tough when things came to having to tell it like it is. And because we have no idea what went on in that very long, almost 2-hour meeting, that's what I'm really worried about at this point. What is the readout? And the fact that people have to say we're still thinking about what's coming out of it, and meanwhile, President Putin, at least what I've heard on the news, is already talking about how to, quote, implement what they decided in that meeting, and we have no idea.
Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Allison.